Hi, my name is Danielle, and today I will be presenting my research, which has looked at the attitudes and behaviours of snorkelers at Turquoise Bay and Oyster Stacks, Ningaloo. First, I would like to acknowledge this study was conducted on the lands of the Jinagadira people of Ningaloo, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. Some of you may not yet be acquainted with the location of the Ningaloo Reef, so let's zoom into Australia, and again to the region. And here we are looking at the map of the Ningaloo region. We can see the Ningaloo Marine Park indicated by the blue polygon along this western coastline, and the adjacent Cape Range National Park is indicated in this orange polygon. The closest town of Exmouth is indicated here by the little red dot, and the two study sites used in this study are located approximately here. The region itself is quite remote, approximately 1,200 kilometres from the nearest capital city of Perth. The Ningaloo Reef is a fringing reef and World Heritage listed site, stretching for approximately 300 kilometres along this section of coastline. The reef itself provides habitat to a large variety of corals and fish, and significant and threatened megafauna species such as whale sharks, dugongs, manta rays, turtles and dolphins. Aside from its ecological significance, the reef is also culturally, socially and economically important to the region as a major tourism drawcard with visitors from across the globe. And snorkelling has been rated as the top activity in the park, and visitor rates have been steadily increasing over the last decade, which has led park managers to raise concerns regarding potential impacts. And they're not wrong to be concerned. My exploration of the literature found that evidence that other popular snorkelling sites around the world had been essentially loved to death, and that there were four major themes which were crucial to understanding the interactions between snorkelers and the reef. Location is really important. Part of what makes Ningaloo so popular is that it is accessible directly from the shore. Being so close to the coast also means that it tends to be shallower, and where it's less than 2 metres, as you can see from the diagram at the bottom here, it's pretty easy to make contact with the corals, which themselves may be quite fragile or vulnerable to breakage depending on their species type. Kicking and standing on the corals were the most commonly cited damaging behaviours, which can be related to how shallow a site is. But the main causes of damaging behaviour were mostly cited as people who were viewed as ill at ease in the water or with the snorkelling gear, or those who simply didn't know that the behaviour they were engaging in was damaging. Interestingly, but unsurprisingly, the attitudes and perceptions of most visitors were that they were seeking to connect with nature and that they took great pleasure in the experience. So we've seen now that research into how snorkelers impact the reefs has been addressed. The question which I think is more important is why, and this is the basis of this study. Behavioural theories, such as these I've listed here on the left, look at what influences behavioural intentions to understand what drives behaviour, and thus informed my approach of looking at the snorkeler's ability, values, knowledge, perceptions, and behaviours to better understand how all these variables relate. So the two study sites for this project were Turquoise Bay and Oyster Stacks, and they both fall within the Ningaloo Marine Park as described earlier, and they are both accessible directly from the shore via the Cape Range National Park. Both sites are popular with snorkelling, but as you can see from these images, they are quite different in their morphology, vulnerability, and visitation rates. Looking firstly at Turquoise Bay in the top images, moving left to right, we have the bathymetry, the habitat map, and aerial imagery. And from this, we can see that there is a deeper lagoon at the shore before it becomes more shallow and more coral and macroalgae dominant, indicated in the center image by the reds and greens and orange pixels. This yellow pixelation close to the coastline here indicates a sandy lagoon, and we can see this highlighted again in that aerial image where you can see the shadowing of the coral and algae and a bare sort of lagoon. By contrast, oyster stacks in the bottom images, we can see that it is more consistently shallow directly from the shore with immediate coral and macroalgae dominance, as shown again by those green, red and orange pixels close to the shoreline. And again in that aerial image you can see it as well. And the means of entry is different. Turquoise Bay has an easy sort of beach entry by contrast to Oyster Stacks, which has a more difficult rocky entry type. So to know about what people think and do, it's best to simply ask. I initially had intended to engage in an intercept style survey at the two study sites. However, the onset of COVID-19 meant that I was unable to travel and so were all of the visitors. So we changed the game plan and came up with an online survey distributed to past visitors to the adjacent Cape Range National Park who had snorkeled at either of the study sites in the selected months from September of 2019 to March of 2020. A total of 3,571 visitors were contacted via email to participate in the survey, and of those, 525 people responded with a visit distribution which more or less fitted the expected trend, as you can see on this graph here, which shows the average car counter data for Turquoise Bay from 2016 to 2019, the survey sample total, and the survey respondents. The survey itself had a total of 45 questions, which were Likert scaled multiple choice and some short answer open questions. And I will show some examples on the next slide. In terms of analysis, I took a straightforward approach using chi-squared test for association and Kramer's V or Spearman's rank order correlation for strength and direction, depending on the data type. So to give you an idea of the questions that were in the survey, I have included one from each variable. So in terms of ability, I asked people, how many laps of a 25-metre pool can you swim without stopping or touching the bottom? That was a 4-part multiple choice response ranging from none, I cannot swim, up to more than 8 laps. In terms of value-based characteristics, I asked, for me, avoiding contact with a coral reef while snorkeling this was a 7-point Likert scaled question ranging from extremely important to extremely unimportant. In terms of knowledge, I asked people were they aware of the tide height before they arrived at Turquoise Bay or Oyster Stacks, a simple yes or no response. In terms of perceptions of damaging behaviours, I asked, indicate the level of negative impact you think the following has. There was a range of behaviours, including walking, sitting or standing on the corals, and the response was a 7-point Likert scale ranging from no impact to very high impact. In terms of self-reported in-water behaviours, I asked people, how often did you find yourself making contact with the corals while snorkeling at each of the sites? In order to reduce social desirability bias and increase the likelihood of an honest response, I included a preface statement, which was, people often report making contact with corals due to unfamiliarity with the area or equipment, water conditions, or their own swimming ability. And this is essentially to make it more okay for people to give an honest response. I also included these behavioural and personal and behavioural characteristic questions, which included all of the typical demographic questions such as age, gender, place of origin, and so on, but also some questions such as how many times did you visit the following site or what sort of fins did you use? But the heart of this study was looking at the relationships between the variables, and what I found was that values had the largest proportion of significant associations with perceptions, followed by knowledge and ability. Values also had the largest proportion of significant associations with behaviour, followed again by knowledge and ability. Perceptions also had a high proportion of significant associations with behaviours. What I found throughout the data was a fairly consistent pattern where the highest proportion of responses indicated strong ability, pro-environment values, high knowledge, high perception of damaging behaviours, and few self-reported coral contacting behaviours. I will now go into more detail describing these results. Here we are looking at ability as the ease with which people were able to avoid contact with the corals on the x-axis, ranging from extremely difficult on the left across to extremely easy on the right, against behaviours as people's self-reported contacts, which is indicated as continuous contact in the hotter red colours down to never made contact in the cooler blue colours. And I've inserted the adjusted residuals into the relevant proportions, and you can see this pattern that I was describing, where the largest contributor to the significant association was for those who found avoiding contact with the corals was extremely easy, and who also reported that they never made contact with the corals. And you can see this is true for both Turquoise Bay in the top graph and Oyster Stacks in the bottom graph. You can also see from these adjusted residuals that I've inserted that as reported ability decreases, we also see the self-reported contact rates increasing. Here on this graph, we're looking at the values as the importance which people placed on avoiding contact with the corals on the x-axis, ranging from extremely unimportant on the left across to extremely important on the right, against their behaviour as they tried to avoid contact with the corals, ranging from strongly agree in the cooler blue colours down to strongly disagree in the hotter red colours. And again, I've inserted the adjusted residuals into the relevant proportions. And what we can see here is that those respondents who reported that they believed avoiding contact with the corals was extremely important were more likely to also report that they strongly agreed that they tried to avoid contact with the corals. And here again, we can see the suggestion of this pattern, where as the importance is decreasing, so is the agreement with having tried to avoid contact. Here we are looking at knowledge as the awareness of the tide height prior to visit on the x-axis as either a yes or no response against behaviour as people's self-reported contacts, ranging from continuous contact in the hotter red colours to never made contact in the cooler blue colours. And we've got turquoise bay at the top and oyster stacks at the bottom. And now again, looking at the adjusted residuals, which I've inserted into the relevant proportions, we can see that those who were aware of the tide height prior to visiting were more likely to make fewer contacts with the coral as compared to those who were not aware of the tide height and were thus more likely to make more frequent coral contacts. We can also see that this is more significant for oyster stacks, which, as described previously, is a more shallow site. Now here we're looking at perceptions as the impact of walking, sitting or standing on the corals in the x-axis, ranging from no impact on this left hand to very high impact on the right hand side, against the behaviour as respondents having tried to avoid contact with the corals, where the hotter colours indicate the strongly disagreed that they tried to avoid contact, and cooler colours indicating that they strongly agreed that they tried to avoid contact. We see here again from the adjusted residuals the suggestion of this trend, and that the largest contributor to the significant association was for those who reported that they perceived the impact of walking, standing or sitting on the corals to be very high, but also agreed that they had tried their best to avoid contact with the corals while snorkeling. And again, you can see this pattern where as perception is decreasing, the agreement is also decreasing. What these results show is that overall, respondents tended to be capable and conscientious. Although ability was not a strong indicator of perceptions, this study's results confirm the suggestion made in previous research that stronger swimmers or more capable snorkelers were less likely to make contact with the coral. Also, that knowledge, such as awareness of the tide height, plays a key role in reducing damaging behaviour, especially at shallower, more vulnerable sites such as oyster stacks. Perceptions values had the most significant associations with both perceptions and behaviours, and this is important as this study supported previous research suggesting that people who engage in activities like snorkeling do so because they want to engage with the environment and have an inherent interest in and compassion for the reef that they have travelled so far to see. The main limitations of this study were that since we were unable to survey people in person, there is a lag in between when they visited and when they took the survey. But the question phrasing was designed to limit this as an issue by making it quite specifically general. The sample is also biased towards those who camped in the Cape Range National Park, so those visitors who didn't stay in the park were not captured. Also, this is based on what people have told us they do. Other studies have incorporated observing people, and this would be a really useful way to ground truth the results against reality. It is recommended to use targeted messaging for those who are less capable, steering them away from the more vulnerable and difficult sites such as oyster stacks, and using normative messaging to target the greatest influencing variable of people's values, something like 95% of visitors don't touch the corals. In conclusion, what this study indicates is that most people value the reef and do not want to cause damage to the very thing that they've travelled to see. Further, where this sample is fairly representative of typical visitors to these sites, long-term damages from increasing numbers of visitors snorkeling at these sites, which was the concern of the park managers, is likely to be limited. However, limited does not mean negligible, and this is where the very important work of park managers comes in, continuing to promote their culture of care, which is evident throughout the park. I would like to acknowledge that this research was supported by the Department of Biodiversity, Conservation and Attractions, and also by Murdoch University and the Harry Butler Institute. Are there any questions?